Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to have ex-BigLaw recruiter Sadie Jones with us to discuss the most common questions we get about job interviewing. Your Law School Toolbox host is Allison Monahan, and typically I'm with Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together with the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started. Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to have ex-recruiter Sadie Jones with us, here to talk about the most common questions we get about job interviewing. So welcome, Sadie.
Thanks for having me back.
My pleasure. So our listeners, maybe you have an interview for a law job, so congratulations. So here's some questions we get a lot. First up, let's talk about how to prepare. So what do I need to know about this organization or this position before I go into this interview?
Well, I definitely want to know the basics. What are their main practice areas? Where do they have offices? I would look up any recent big cases they've had so that you feel current on it. If they recently had a merger or they took on a new practice group, things like that, like current things. In terms of the position, obviously you want to know if it's for a specific practice group, and even if you're a summer associate, do they divide their summer associates out by practice group? So I think you kind of want to know the basics.
Right, and that applies for law firm jobs, and I think the same concept applies elsewhere. If you're working for a public interest organization or hope to be working for one that you're interviewing with, you want to know the basics off of their website. What exactly did they do? What areas are they interested in? How many people work there? Do they have offices elsewhere? Maybe where do they get their funding? What's their mission? Most of the stuff is going to be on the website. It can be a little trickier, I think, if you're applying maybe for a government position, because you may not be able to get that much information. But again, they're going to have a website. So whatever organization it is that you're working for or hope to be working for, make sure that you do know the basics just about what they do so that you're not sticking your foot in your mouth and talking about something that's totally not relevant.
Absolutely. You want to make sure that they feel like you're really interested in that, even if you're applying for a lot of places.
Yeah, exactly. You want to make it seem like this is a place that you're really interested in, and hopefully you are interested if you've gotten an interview. Okay, so sometimes I know they will tell you in advance, whether we're talking about firms or other organizations, who you're going to be interviewing with. How much research do you think people need to do about these interviewers?
Well, I think you want to see if they have a bio online, and I would also Google their names sort of generally, again, like I was saying before, to see if they've done something big recently. So you want to know where they went to school, what practice group they're in, if they say anything specific about themselves. Even something like a hobby or where they grew up, if there's something that you can relate to or maybe, can talk to. You don't necessarily, but it's good to know. I would say that, but also realize that things change and a lot of things can change at the last minute. So don't assume that that's going to be your final schedule. You also have to be able to roll with it. If you get there and they say, oh, blah, blah, had a conflict, and so you're going to see someone else, they don't expect you to know anything about the new person. But you should be able to, come up with questions, even if you haven't looked it up before.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think you want to have the basics. And I think, looking at, are they maybe involved in outside organizations? Or do they list pro bono projects? That type of stuff is really nice to bring up, even if you don't allude to it directly. I think you have to be a little careful about not looking like a stalker here. But, if you do see on their bio on the website that they have a lot of these outside interests, maybe they're on the board of a charity organization or they list their pro bono, I think that's a nice topic to bring up, like, what type of stuff do you do outside of the office that's law related? And what they're going to talk to you about, so.
Yeah. And I agree with you. You don't want to go overboard.
Yeah.
Or say something odd. We had a candidate once who just said to the interviewer, "So I see your tie." And it was really odd.
Like,
and I think the interviewer, yes. And it was because they'd done all this research about where they grown up, and it was weird. It was just too much about their background.
I've had that occasionally happen. People will be like, "Oh, I learned about this thing." And you're like, "Really? How and where and why did you find this out?" And it was something that up here, maybe on like page 4 of a Google search type thing. It wasn't like really obvious. Like, "Oh, you went to law school at wherever." Exactly. It was very weird stuff. So you don't need to show off your knowledge necessarily. It's really more for background. On that point, to what extent do people need to have questions prepared in advance?
I would say you should always have a running list of questions that you can go to, if they say at the end, do you have any questions? And I would say, you should have a running list of sort of general questions. And I think that's important in case you sort of forget anything, you like can't remember which this place is compared to the other place, or you can't think of anything, your mind goes blank. You have these set questions, that you could always go to. But then I do think that it's a good idea to try to have something more specific or tailored to where you are, or that kind of thing. I think it's very unlikely that the interviewers are going to know what you asked another interviewer. It comes up occasionally, like in a hiring committee meeting, so I wouldn't constantly reuse the same questions, like ask every interviewer the same question. But, I think you can repeat them. Also, it can be interesting to see what different people say about the same question. So I think you absolutely have to have something prepared and, as specific to the position as you can make it is a good idea.
Yeah, I always like to ask people, well, tell me a little bit about what your average day might look like, or, what type of cases are you working on right now? Are there things that are taking a lot of your time? Because people like to talk about themselves, A, and B, it was interesting to hear, oh, I'm doing this big motion, or I'm doing this trial, blah, blah, blah. So something like that, I think you definitely could ask everybody. Do you have any other ideas on questions that people typically could bring up that would be pretty safe?
Yeah, I think what you said is a great idea, and that's usually the go-to that I say to people, what's an average day? I think you can ask them a little more, if it's specific to a practice group, about some area of their work, if there's something you're genuinely interested in, things like that. I think more generally, if it's a summer associate position, I think you can ask things like, how's the work assigned? What's the mentor program? I think all of those things are kind of like safe areas. Places I would stay away from would be probably too much about pro bono. I know there are some places that really promote it, and I think that's okay if we're talking about the law firm side. But generally, I don't think that's where you go in the interview. That's where you go after you get the job offer. Same with work-life balance. I don't think that's a good idea to ask in the interview.
Yeah, I would definitely not ask about like, well, how many hours do you work and that kind of thing, just because... even it is a very valid question, but it's also a question you can ask after you have the offer and probably shouldn't be asking before because it just puts you in a slightly weird light. With that being said, if there are things that would be mission critical for you in terms of, maternity leave or paternity leave or any sort of thing like that, you can ask about it, but I'd still probably wait until later.
Absolutely. I think there's always times to do that if it's going to be something that would affect you taking the job or not. But I don't necessarily think that is the time. So I would definitely pick with sort of safer top.
I agree. All right. So how should I be prepared to talk about something weird on my resume? Because let's face it, most people have something that probably is going to draw some attention, not necessarily totally favorably, whether it is one bad grade, or you have an unusual background, or you don't have a lot of work experience, or you have too much work experience, you have an employment gap, all these things. So there's going to be something that people are probably going to ask you about that you're not that eager to talk about. So how should people prepare for this?
Well, I think preparing for it at all is sort of the answer. So I think that you need to have a story that you've practiced and that makes sense. So if you took a year off, let's say to, help a sick family member, that's okay. Everyone understands that life happens, but you just need to be able to explain it. I would say also with those sorts of things, just answer the question. I wouldn't go super elaborate with it. And none of these things are things you need to proactively bring up. I think sometimes people tend to sort of over talk about the things that they're self-conscious about. And it sort of just highlights it. It makes it seem like you're not okay with it. So I would say, have a cohesive answer for whatever, the situation is. Or let's say that your career path has been sort of meandering. You've done a lot of different things. You can explain how you got to where you are and, emphasize the positive. So emphasize how excited you are to be doing this right now. And this is your passion and this is what you want to do. So answer it, but don't go overboard.
I think that's right. And with a bad grade thing, I mean, oftentimes people will ask you that just to see how you react. And so again, like you need a storyline. Maybe, yes, you didn't do so well in this class first semester, but you turned it around second semester and you did really well. That's Lee's story with her legal writing. She did not do well legal writing first semester. Then she did a lot more effort, talked to her teacher, etc., and Callie'd the class second semester. And she's like, of course, people asked me about it, but I just told them that story and then we moved on. So I think the thing you don't want to be is super defensive and, blaming your professor or blaming something else. You just need to own it, basically.
Same with, I think if you transferred schools, never be negative about the first school. I think just generally don't be negative. Just focus on the positive.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the appropriate transfer story is probably something along the lines of, well, it was a really fantastic experience and I did very well, but I had this amazing opportunity and I took it.
Absolutely.
There doesn't need to be any more than that. No one needs the details.
Exactly.
And finally, about preparation, do people need to practice interviewing? And if so, how can they do that?
You absolutely should practice interviewing. And I think there are a lot of opportunities that law students don't take that are available to them. So I know at law firms, they always come on campus and do mock interviews, or even students can go to law firms and do mock interviews. And I was always surprised that we would have empty slots where people didn't take them up on that. That is a really prime opportunity to get real experience in interviewing and usually also get feedback, which again, you should not be defensive about. You want real feedback. You want to know what they really think. You wear a suit, you do all, the things you would do in a real interview. I mean, I think you could really practice with anyone. I think it's not ideal necessarily to practice with people who really know you well. You might not get real feedback. It may not feel like an interview. So I think, if there's any opportunities at your school, through alumni associations, through bar association events, for law students, there's lots of opportunities, I think, to do that kind of thing.
Yeah. And I think one good idea too, and if you are doing it with someone who knows you well, is set up a camera. You've got a video on your phone, and that alone can sometimes make people feel like it's more of a real thing. And also you can see yourself, and that is typically not a very pleasant experience, but it's something that you need to look at because you need to see, are you fidgeting in weird ways? What are you doing with your hands? Are you twirling your hair? Are you picking at your fingers? There are all these like weird tics that people have, and we just don't really realize them. Are you making eye contact? Are you looking around the room? Do you look suspicious? You can see a lot if you videotape yourself and make yourself watch it. You can also hear, do you say like a lot? Do you say a lot? Are there a lot of filler words? Are you not getting to the point? True. So I think that's a great idea. That's always painful when we get these transcripts from the podcast and you see what you actually sound like. And I think it can be really hard afterwards because you tell yourself, I don't want to say like anymore. And then you hear every time you say it. Right. But I think that can actually make a change that's positive. It can. And I think you can also see whether you have a tendency to interrupt people. That's something that you might not notice, but if you see it on tape, you realize you're constantly interrupting the other person. Like that's going to look really rude if you're in an interview. I think that's a great idea. All right. So videotape yourself, make yourself watch it, and it'll be unfun, but you'll probably learn something. All right. So moving on to a couple of classic questions, what to bring and what to wear. So should I wear a suit or what should I wear? You have to wear a suit 100% of the time. I've seen people not get offers based on not wearing a full suit. So yes, you need to wear a full suit with a jacket. I think, everyone has a personality. I don't think they have to look exactly the same, but I do think generally in an interview, it should be conservative. There shouldn't be anything that's distracting. I don't think you should wear really strong perfume.
I don't think you should wear anything that stands out so much as, loud or anything like that. I think you want to look nice and put together, and, you can have some accessories that, show who you are. And I think you can wear color. You shouldn't wear a purple suit, but, you can find places to wear color. So I think it should just be conservative. Yeah, and I think, which maybe sounds boring, but it's an interview.
Well, and I think this advice applies, generally speaking, across the board. I mean, you're never going to, if you go to any interview for a legal job in a suit, you're not probably going to be inappropriately dressed. I think there are cases outside of a firm world where maybe you could get away with wearing something else. And this is a fair question to ask whoever set up your interview. Is there a dress code? That type of thing. They're not going to necessarily, they're not going to ding you for asking what you should wear,
right,
if it's not obvious. But generally speaking, I think you're always going to be safe regardless of what type of interview it is. If you show up in a suit looking fairly conservative, put together, nothing flashy. I mean, it's a boring profession, let's face it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if it's a startup or something like that, or a much younger environment, that's, where I would ask. And they may still want you to wear a suit.
Yeah, or they may
that's what they want to see in their, intern.
Yeah, and in a way, actually, it's easier just to put a suit on than to try to figure out if they tell you, like, oh, no, you don't need to dress up. It's like, okay, well, what do you wear then? That gets actually a lot more complicated. And then you get into, like, if you're a woman, is it a sweater set type situation? Like, what are we talking about? I honestly just prefer to throw on the standard suit outfit and do the interview, but that's just me.
I think most law students, lawyers, they're not going to be judged for looking too boring. They're only going to be judged for wearing something really inappropriate.
Exactly. All right. So what should people bring with them in terms of copies of their resume, other materials, that type of thing?
So I think you should always have multiple copies of your resume, your transcripts, any other materials. References are probably a good idea just to have. Nobody may ask you for it, and that's okay. It's better to have it. Especially if something's been updated, let's say, and you haven't gotten a chance to get it to them, I would give everybody a copy, and point out maybe you won an award, something positive, things like that. Although you should try to get it to them before the interview. But I do think you should have copies of everything. Maybe you didn't have a full transcript before. Just very, upfront about having all your stuff together. And in terms of, what to bring it in, I'd bring it in, an envelope inside of your bag, make sure there's no way anything's, folded over or not neat or not flat, things like that.
Yeah, and the bag situation is one where women finally have an actual advantage because they can just bring a professional-looking purse that's big enough to carry all of this stuff. There are tons and tons of fairly conservative options. Men, on the other hand, there's always this question of, well, do I have to bring a briefcase? I think the answer to that is no. But you need a nice portfolio, basically.
Yeah, the thing I don't like, and I don't know if everyone would agree with me, is the backpack look.
Oh, God. No.
I don't think for lawyers, but I am surprised at how many law students have shown up with backpacks. And usually we sort of leave it in somebody's office at the beginning because they can't really walk around with it. So I would just say, don't do that. Messenger bag works. That's okay. They're sort of nicer looking.
Yeah, but even then, I think most men should just really show up with some sort of, leather looking portfolio that has their documents in it. And then you put your keys and your phone, which you should turn off, into a pocket or something like that. This is a place to travel light. So if you drive, leave the stuff in your car. If you're in a city, it's obviously a little bit harder, but you can still figure out some way that you don't need to be carrying a Sherpa's worth of stuff here.
Absolutely. It's just awkward. It feels weird.
Yeah, exactly. So women, finally, we get one that's actually easier for us. Buy yourself a nice, conservative looking bag. You'll use it for court. Make sure you can fit your laptop in it. You're good to go.
Yeah.
All right. Well, how about some tips for a virtual interview? So something like a phone or video chat. What should people be ready for here?
Well, I guess first off, make sure all your technology works. So that it's a quiet place, that you have a good connection. I would call somebody from that location, make sure, you can hear them, at least from your end. There could be technical problems on the other end. I think you want to cover all your bases on your end. And then for the video, obviously you want to make sure that you're dressed in the same way I think that you would be for an interview if we're talking about, a law firm sort of thing or, any legal job. And you want to make sure, what are they seeing in the background? Where are you sitting? That sort of thing. I just think you don't want anything that's going to be distracting or anything like that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think if you are doing it from your home, you need to think about, do I need a microphone? Do I need headphones? Ask these questions well in advance and make sure you understand how you're going to be connecting, because there's nothing worse than kind of getting there and thinking you know how to connect, and then it turns out that's not really working, and you've got 10 minutes of back and forth and everybody's getting stressed out, and are you going to be able to do the interview? You just want to make sure that you can get this done. Sometimes you have to go someplace, so then, obviously you just need to be dressed like it's a normal interview.
Yeah, I think that is obviously easier in a lot of ways. Yeah. Also, if you're at home, make sure there's no distractions. Make sure you've told anyone else who lives there, you're on an interview. If you have a pet, put them away. I don't think they want to hear,
right. Turn your phone off. Turn all the phones off. You might forget about your landline, and then telemarketers start calling you. That's always the way it seems to go. And then also, it can be a little bit of a weird scenario. So I think just accepting that it's not exactly the same as an in-person. If you're interviewing with multiple people, it might be a little bit unclear where you're supposed to be looking or something like that. But I think just trying to roll with that sort of stuff and really focus on the questions is the way to go.
Yeah, and I think you sort of stand out if you do that well, because everyone does know that these things are sort of awkward, and you don't get, as good of a feel for people probably that way as you would in person. So I think you just want to do your best to show, you're not worried about all that other stuff. You're focused on, the job and what you're talking about.
Exactly. All right, let's talk a little bit about the interview itself. So what if the interviewer either has nothing to say or is just clearly totally unprepared for this?
I say you help them out. You make it better. It's on you to make this a good interview then. I think that happens a lot. I think that there's lots of awkward people in the legal profession people aren't used to doing this. And, it may be people who don't do interviews a lot. You don't know. So I would say, you should be ready to ask questions and keep things moving. I think that says a lot, and I think that even though the interviewer kind of should be driving the conversation, that's just not the way it goes sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you shouldn't take this personally. I definitely got called in at the last second if somebody was stuck in court or stuck in traffic or whatever it was, and literally got a call from the recruiter saying, hey, we kind of have this situation. I need you to take this person on in 10 minutes. I'm going to email you their resume. And so I'm like, okay, I've got time, so I'll do it. But, obviously I'm not fully informed about the situation. And so sometimes they wouldn't even have time to send me a resume, or it wouldn't be, so I would have to ask the person, which is a great reason to be carrying your resume. Because, if I ask them and they don't give it to me, then, okay, everything just got exponentially harder. Now what are we going to talk about? But it wasn't a reflection of them as a candidate or that we didn't care about them. It's just something came up and I had to step into the last second and was doing the best I could in the situation.
And really, as a candidate, that could be a prime opportunity for them to tell you about themselves in a way that's, really great and, flattering for their story and that kind of thing. So I think it's sort of an opportunity to tell them about you.
Yeah, and this is also another reason, as we talked about last time, to have some interest on your resume, because if you just hand it to me and I'm frantically looking for something to talk to you about, probably I'm going to go straight to what you're interested in, because that's at least going to buy me a couple of minutes so I can read the rest of it.
No, I think that's perfect. And I think, it's just everyone understands these kind of things happen. Things don't go exactly according to plan.
Yeah, welcome to the legal profession.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so what if the interviewer either asks something inappropriate or if they behave inappropriately in some way? How should people handle that?
Well, I would say it probably depends on the level of inappropriateness. I think there are things that, aren't great, but you could brush aside. I think if you feel really uncomfortable, one, you probably don't want to work at a place that's like that anyway. So I think you can say what you want. If you feel that you need to say something, I think you can. I think a lot of things, you can probably get through the interview and say something after. So I think it sort of depends on the level of what the situation is and how it makes you feel.
Yeah, I remember the first OCI interview I did. It was like this lecherous old partner who was blatantly hitting on me, and it was really just one of those things where you're like, is this actually happening right now? Like, what am I supposed to do? Like, I'm literally in a weird hotel room setting with this crazy person who is like, I was like, oh my gosh. So in that case, I basically just kind of politely got through it, and then they offered me a call back, and I said no, and the recruiter asked me why, and I basically told her, and she was mortified.
And I think you should tell them.
Yeah.
I think that's a situation where they want to know.
Yeah. And then she was just like, oh my God. I'm like, this person, probably shouldn't be working for you, but definitely should not be doing first round interviews, just FYI,
Yeah.
But yeah, it was super weird and just kind of like gross, the whole thing. All right. What about people who are really aggressive or they seem like they're being mean to you?
I think this kind of thing can happen sort of as a test. I think some interview styles are sort of like that, where they're sort of pushing you on things. What I would say is don't be defensive. Don't give that to them. Let them act how they want. I say, like, you act in a way that's not saying that that's okay or not sort of giving in to that kind of thing. I also think it's good to know if that's the style at the place, because it may not be a place you want to work.
I think that's true. I think a lot of particularly old school litigators like to do this type of thing. They'll latch on to one thing on your resume or your transcript and just kind of not let go of it, or they'll start really asking you like very specific substantive questions or something that like you would totally outside of your field of expertise, you have no way of knowing, and really they're just doing it to see your reaction. But you can also decide that, okay, I don't really want to work with people who would do this sort of thing. So I think you just have to stay calm and kind of, roll with it, and then later reflect on whether this is a place that you might want to work or not.
And if they're asking you something you don't know, I don't think you should just make something up. No. That's not my area. I haven't learned that.
Yeah, or like,
whatever it is.
You're asking me about something that we studied my first semester of law school. To be honest, like I don't really recall the details right now. If I had to research this for a case, obviously I would go and do the research. Like,
right.
What are they going to say? Like, you should remember every single thing you've ever studied in law school. That's not reasonable.
Absolutely. So I agree. It's more about how you handle it.
Yeah. All right. I kind of briefly touched on this earlier, but what topics do you think people should try to avoid in interviews?
Well, I think sort of what I was saying before about things they're uncomfortable with. I don't think they should avoid them, but I also don't think you should highlight things that, aren't things you want them focused on. I think you sort of answer and move on. Like I said, I definitely think you should avoid things about work-life balance. I think if it's a situation where maybe you would want to transfer to another office, I probably wouldn't bring it up then. I wouldn't bring up anything where it seems like you're going to need special, accommodations about things, or you're going to ask for a lot of things, or you're going to be difficult, or, you're selling yourself, you want to get the job.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think this is the time to be like, oh, anything's great, and not like, well, I have to have this very specific practice group and I have to work with this person. You can talk about all those things later. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the aftermath of an interview. So you've gone to the interview, you think it went pretty well. Should people send thank you notes?
This is controversial. I'm not a big fan of the thank you note. I think that it's an opportunity where you might mess up. So I think as a general rule, I wouldn't just send them to everyone that I talk to, unless you're just going to keep it short or you have something really specific that you connected with the person on. I think that is maybe a reason to send a thank you note. I think you need to make sure if they're handwritten, that they're legible, that there's no typos, that there's nothing that will come across in a negative way at all, because I've seen thank you notes ruin an offer for somebody. And not getting a thank you note, I've never heard anyone say, I didn't get a thank you note, we can't make that person an offer.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, you could also send a short email if you want to. But again, I don't think this is required, and it is an easy thing to screw up. I mean, occasionally if you got a nice note, I might be like, oh, that person's nice. But I've probably already written my evaluation if it arrived in the mail by that point. So, I think the most effective, at least for me as an interviewer, were people who sent a very short follow-up email that day or maybe the next morning saying, I really enjoyed speaking with you. I enjoyed hearing about this case, mention the case name or whatever you told me you were working on. I'm interested in the position. I mean, that's pretty much all it is. But, you want to make sure you don't mix up who you talk to about what or various things like that, because that definitely would get negative attention, whereas the nice email might get me to think 1 second, like, oh, they're kind of nice, but it's not really going to impact me that much.
Yeah, I think you just, exactly what you said, you have to be careful not to mix anything up. So you have to be 100% sure that if you mention something specific, that person's going to know what you're talking about. Also, a little secret tip, if you send a thank you note to the recruiter, they're going to really appreciate that. That's the person I would send the thank you note
there
to.
You go.
Because I would say they're few and far between and they're memorable. That's the person who's also going to be in the meeting talking about you. And they probably didn't have as much time to sit down with you. So something like that is going to make a difference. So that's my secret insider tip.
Good to know. Yeah, I can say actually a nice email like, thank you so much for setting up this day. I really enjoyed meeting with a variety of people that you had me talk with. If there's any questions I can answer for you, please let me know. It doesn't have to be anything major.
Exactly. I think it's perfect.
All right. So if it's been a little while and I haven't heard anything, is it okay to follow up?
It's okay to follow up once. So if you haven't heard anything, especially it's also okay to say if, let's say, you have another offer. And don't lie here. Don't say you have something you don't have somewhere else. So just be honest. So if you have something that, let's say, is going to expire and you want to know more about their timeline, and that's information that they'll want to know too, if they need to kind of push you up in terms of making a decision. So I think, that's specifically fine. And I think following up and just saying, I'm really interested, just wanted to know about your timeline. I think that's something also that you can ask the recruiter or whoever you meet with, someone from HR at the beginning or at the end of the interview. But what you don't want to do is be the person who's following up every few days, wants to know, they probably have not forgotten about you. It's just their process. They're trying to work it out. And I think there's a point where it can get annoying and work against you, because if they're on the fence, it's this person is bugging me all the time. It's like a negative.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's fair and pretty much expected almost to ask as you're leaving. Typically there's going to be some sort of wrap-up session where you can say, do you have any sense of what your next steps are or what the timing might be on this? And they might say no, but typically they're going to say, we hope to get back to you in whatever time frame. All right. But yeah, definitely do not be a pest. That's not going to help you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Finally, so some people write and say, I'm really introverted and I feel like I'm just not very good at interviewing. What can people do to get better?
Well, I think what we were saying before about practicing and watching yourself, which again probably is even more painful if you're particularly introverted to have to watch it. But I think that's the kind of person who watching it will help. I think maybe even making yourself do more things that make you have to talk about yourself or get outside your shell. So more networking things, because I think it's a skill as a lawyer that you are going to need to develop at some point. I also think you could be an introvert and still connect with someone one-on-one and be able to tell your story, without a problem.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think if you don't feel like you're very good at interviewing, just do more interviews. There's really no other way to get better at it, just practice. So, you might try to set up some less critical interviews before more important ones, or you might even try informational interviewing where you invite people out just to talk with them. But you're going to have to push yourself on this because it's not something that's ever going to go away.
Yeah, and I think that if you work on it earlier as a law student, it's only going to benefit you later in your career.
Yeah, absolutely.
I also think do not beat yourself up if you do one and it doesn't go well or you feel bad about it. Move on to the next one. It's okay. It happens.
I mean, everybody has bad interviewers. You can be the world's best interviewer and you still or interviewee, and you're still going to sometimes have a bad day, or you're going to be off, or you're going to say something you wish you hadn't said. I mean, that's just what happens. Yep. So I think you just want to take away what you can learn from the experience and use that for the future and not, beat yourself up. And if it is something that you really struggle with, then get help with it.
Yep.
You can work with us, for example. We're happy to do practice interviews. Any final thoughts before we move on?
I would say you should definitely prepare, and we've given you a lot of tips, but I also think that you need to let your personality shine through. And you want to show them who you are. And I think everywhere I've worked, there's always this factor that, different people call it different things, sparkle, something factor. And I would say that is what you want to show them. So I wouldn't prepare so much that you feel like, you can't have your personality there and you're not ready for something, that they may just like ask you offhand and that sort of thing. So you want to be a professional and you want to be prepared, but you also, want to show them who you are as a person.
I think that's right. You want to be sort of the shiniest, nicest version of yourself.
Absolutely.
And I think one thing really to focus on and avoiding, if you think this could be an issue for you, is sometimes law students can be very arrogant. And I think that is a real turnoff in an interview. So if you do have those tendencies, I think that is something you definitely want to try to get under control, because that will turn people off immediately, basically.
And I think if you're doing any of these practice things and someone tells you that honestly, you really need to try not to be defensive about it and try to look at it objectively, because maybe that's not who you really are as a person, but that is what they saw. So you got to figure out a way to dial that back.
Yeah, I think any sort of feedback that you get that's negative in these practice interviews, although it's very difficult, I think you do have to take it seriously, because maybe that person is off base, but it's also something that they perceived. And if they perceived it, there's a pretty good chance someone else might perceive it and also react negatively to it. So, we all have things that maybe are not the best part of our personalities that we probably don't want to bring out in an interview. So I think, getting those, being able to identify what those things are for you and thinking about how you're going to overcome them or not bring them out, I think is worth doing.
Absolutely. And my last piece of advice really is that, once you've gotten to the interview stage, you probably meet all their criteria in a lot of ways. So really a lot of what they're looking for is, who is the person I want to work with? And if, we're at the office at 1 a.m, who's the person I want around? Who's the person I think is going to be a team player? It's not necessarily, who did the best in this class.
Absolutely. Certainly people are interviewing really more for fit than for anything else. And so you just want to think about, what are they looking for? What is the ideal candidate for this job? What are they going to bring to the table? And then figure out how it is that you can show those traits. So not something you necessarily need to, get massively stressed out. And I think people understand, obviously, if you're nervous, they'll probably give you some leeway for that. But the more of these you do, the better you're going to get at them and the more successful you're probably going to be.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, with that, unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you for joining us, Sadie.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, our pleasure. For more career help and the opportunity to work one-on-one with us, including practice interviewing, check out careerdicta.com. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We would really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Allison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at, guess what, lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.